Dan Faggella. Want to come up? We're going to move on to a panel discussion with Steve. I'm pleased to introduce Dan. Dan is the founder and head of Emerge Artificial Intelligence Research. He's been a speaker at many high-profile events and organizations. Dan earned a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and has won many gold medals in nearly a dozen national and international Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitions. So always keep Dan on your side. In 2012, Dan got his master's degree in cognitive science from the University of Pennsylvania, at which time he had an epiphany about the role of AI in the future of life. Since then, he has dedicated his life to, as he says on his website, to guiding the developments of technology and policy that may well guide life beyond humanity. Welcome, Dan.
All right. Okay, perfect. Terrific. Great. So bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to put this slide back up on the screen because I think this is going to create kind of a framework for the discussion that we're planning on having. The panel could go in any direction, and I think we're all familiar with how that happens. But these are some of the things to kind of bear in mind as we move through this discussion. So this is really going to be big questions about alignment and whose values are embedded in AI systems, and whether we should think differently about whether human values should lead the way, whether human values should evolve with the help of AI, or whether AI values should really take the lead and leave human values behind in some way. So these are things to think about. So first question, and I'm going to send this one to Steve first, but of course I'd like to hear from both of you about this. What do you think we should want from AI? So possible choices, are we advancing human values and goals? And if so, are we advancing actual human values or more the idealized human values, right? The things that we sort of aspire to? Are we pursuing truth? Are we pursuing a merger between humanity and AI, or certain individuals and AI? Are we pursuing higher goals than we could possibly imagine, or some combination of these? So that's where I'd like to start. So Steve, maybe you can help us with your understanding of what should we be looking for with AI?
So I may be in the minority, but I am on Team Human at the moment, which is I think this is us, the human species, building a new technology, and potentially very dangerous technology, and that we should be very conservative at first, at least, and build it to support our current human form as best we can. If, going forward after much consideration and voting of the entire humanity on the entire planet, we decide, oh, yes, we can make humans better and this and that, maybe, great, go to it. But I would say there's a huge risk in doing that too early, and that our primary goal should be to solve current human problems, eliminate disease, eliminate poverty, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, good clean water, all those kinds of things. I think AI can help with dramatically. We can make dramatic changes, and I think we can learn a lot. So one of your things on there was truth. I think we should maximize truth. I'm with Elon on that one. Because the more we know, the better choices we can make. But I think we should constrain it and control it so that we don't inadvertently do so. So some small group in Silicon Valley doesn't inadvertently do something which could damage the entire world's population.
I'm double fisting microphones. The first time for fucking everything, I guess. I don't know where the hell I was. Regardless, what I'm different than Steve. I think longer term, so long ball. I think near term, let's make sure we're not going paperclip maximizer. There's many unworthy successors we could imagine. We could imagine things that don't treat humans very well, and we could imagine things that also fritter out and peter out and aren't conscious and don't blossom value into the world. And I think those would be negative outcomes. So carefulness in the early days, I think, is great. Long ball, like very long ball. I think that bubbling up, Steve talked about intelligence developing, to mammalia and then to humanity, et cetera. That bubbling up, I think, has been very valuable. If we didn't have those bubbling ups and we were all still at kind of a sea snail level of intelligence, I think we'd have a much less interesting dialogue going on right now. And I think that if that bubbling up were to stop, that would also be a shame. So I think there's the treatment of our individual torch as a bearer of the flame. I think we should hope that AGI long ball will treat our individual instantiations of consciousness very well. I kind of agree with Preston. I think probably that's not what we think it is. I think most people say, I want to stay in the monkey suit forever. And, I want to go for a walk with my dog or something, when I think an AI would probably just like upload you into a sugar cube to experience like a billion years of hyper expansive super bliss. And that would just be better than whatever idea you have, like almost unquestionably. So for individual human instantiations, I think we should get a really good shake, like a really, really good shake once things are safe. But I do think we should be optimizing for AI to continue to blossom that set of knowledge and capability powers vastly beyond humanity, so that the torch of life eventually can stay lit. So I'm very, very congenial with conservatism in the near term, because we don't know if what we have is a worthy successor. But if the blooming stoppeth, I think that would be a real shame. So I think continuing that blooming of the potentia of life, I think would be what we want to optimize for.
Pete, you could take the mic if you want to weigh in on this question as well.
I think let's just go to question two. I think Dan has pretty much said what I wanted to say, even more eloquently than I could have said it.
Sure. Well, the second question I have is actually, I do want to start with Dan again. It's clear, we've heard from, I think, every speaker tonight, and obviously multitudes of AI researchers, that there is a danger, there are multiple dangers to superintelligence. What, in your view, is the most prominent fear there? What is the foremost fear? Is it autonomous AI? Is it AI as a tool under the control of malevolent humans? Or is it something else? And again, if you wouldn't mind holding the mic so Steve can hear you. Thanks.
Do the old, Steve, you got me now?
Yep, perfect.
All right, now I don't have to double fist anymore. I can just hold them both in one hand, and I can look like a person. I think for me, it's sort of less the pathway. I think that the clear, evident danger from my vantage point is the extinguishment of the flame. So the flame would be all life, so all non-dead matter. So the extinguishment of the flame is the ultimate downside. Certainly the extinguishment of humanity would be very rough, but just to be clear, for me, the extinguishment of the flame is the bigger deal. Just like the flourishing of the flame is, I think, on the grand scale, more important than the flourishing of any individual torch. With that said, I think in the next, let's say, decade, I think that malevolent use of AI would be a reasonably high risk. I would say in the next 5 years, I would consider it more likely that a bioweapon or grand level cyber attack would spurn from some other hominid than from an AI coming up with that goal on its own. But I would say we start to stretch out towards a decade or more. It's really hard to predict anything. And I think autonomous systems could be dangerous too. So there's some things like, Steve had talked about AI controlling robots, AI controlling weapons. I certainly think a lot of conservatism around that is warranted. My guess is that even before AI has access to 1 million robots, which at some point it will, I think people will be able to wield it dangerously. So really near term, I'd say malevolent use. Beyond that, I think it's really more the autonomous stuff that could turn into an unworthy successor.
Sure. And Steve, I'm sorry, Preston, do you want to grab the mic and weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'm far more worried about malevolent humans right now using AI as a tool, as a weapon, in the way that they use other weapons. It's easy. It's not difficult to imagine, given the kind of world that we live in, if somebody had a 10x more powerful weapon, that really bad things could happen like very quickly, and it wouldn't be just some isolated dictator in Russia or some country extremely far from us where this might happen. It's likely to be on the radar of virtually every dictatorial person, in the world, including within this country. I'm much less worried than I was immediately after hearing Jeff Hinton say that AI was going to take over. I think that a lot of the assumptions that were initially made are actually incorrect. And I think that one of the problems is people think that the ambition, I think that Steve's AI drives is foundational and correct. But I think a lot of people misunderstand exactly how they work. They anthropomorphize in the way that they shouldn't and don't anthropomorphize enough in I think, ways that are realistic. One is that I think AIs, very much like humans, will have satiable ambitions. We don't know what it wants. We don't know how it's going to get those things, But it's possible that an AI could actually relatively easily understand the universe. Any remote knowledge outside of its local environment might be completely uninteresting. And so this idea that an AI is going to want to expand and acquire all of the resources of the universe is a anthropomorphic fantasy, I think. We don't know how close to reality that is, but a lot of assumptions about takeover are sort of based on that kind of a thinking. And I think we need to pull back from that and establish a really sound science of AI motivation, starting with the basic AI drives. But I think we need to understand how they might be fulfilled or how satiable they might be before we begin to assume that AI is going to take over and kill everyone.
Dan, I saw you nodding, grimacing at various points there. Do you want to weigh in on that a little bit? And
just drives are famously not satiable. I think the hedonic treadmill is probably the reason we're here. I think if you could just eat enough bananas to chill out, I think we'd still be eating them. And I think most of you live like gods compared to your great grandparents, and many of you are on antidepressants. And so I don't think human drives are all that satiable. And I think that that's probably indicative of nature. I think nature wanting to stay alive is constantly sticking tendrils of in various forms, physical tendrils, but also tendrils of urge to, if you're a mouse, explore your environment to make sure it's safe or find where food is. If you're a human, figure out a way to be useful or learn something or whatever the case may be. I think that propensity, if AGI be AGI, it wouldn't seem to me wholly unrealistic that it would have a lot of those same propensities. And if it was to populate the galaxy with value, to continue the bubbling that we have done from the sea snails to where we are, it wouldn't shock me at all if it would naturally expand in such a way. I can't say for sure if it would, but it would make sense if it would to me personally.
Yeah, I do want to give Steve a chance to weigh in on this, but I have it's sort of an interesting observation that we have this anthropomorphization of our expectation, right? We expect that artificial intelligence or synthetic consciousness will continue along the arc that we've set as biological entities. But Preston, in your paper, you begin that divergence, right? Like you begin to characterize a divergence between biological evolution. Oh, sorry. Pick up this microphone. You begin to lay out a framework of divergence between biological evolution and non-biological evolution, right? Evolution that's purely mindware driven or sort of consciousness driven. So I'm curious for people to dig a little bit more into your publication that came out today, so that we can have I think a more full conversation about what divergence, like what degree of divergence we can expect from non-biological entities that do evolve and that have some governance of their own evolution, not governed by a biological organism or biological intelligence. So, Steve, quickly, if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them. We do have lots more questions, but this is really interesting.
Sure, I'll weigh in on the original question of where the biggest risks are at the moment, and I agree with both Dan and Preston that it's human uses of AI is likely to be the problem, and I think the biggest one for me is cyber attacks. The very first 0 day was discovered by an AI a couple of weeks ago, I think. And so I would expect we're going to have AIs that know all of the vulnerabilities in all the systems of the world, and that those will spread quickly on the dark web, and that hackers are going to use them to just go wild. And so I think we're going to be extremely vulnerable with cyber attacks. If you look at what's going on in Ukraine, both sides are using first commercial, individual drones, and they, modify them to hold grenades, and they got incredible asymmetry in warfare. For a little guy with his drone can drop a grenade on a tank and destroy, a much more expensive piece of equipment. So that has driven both of them to start using more and more drones, and they're both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side are starting to add intelligence to their drones. They're making their drones more autonomous. So I think we get an arc in warfare of humans using AIs in order to do, things that humans want to do. I see a shift. Like OpenAI used to be, we want to develop AGI for the good of humanity. If you look at their description now, it's something like, we develop AGI so that democracy can triumph over totalitarianism. So the us versus them, US versus China in particular, dialectic has just been amped up dramatically. Some government agency 2 days ago, I think, put out a report saying the number one priority for the US is to have Manhattan Project sized AGI development goals with trillion-dollar data centers and power sources, and reactivate the nukes and get them all going so that we can beat China and make sure democracy triumphs. So I think all of that dialogue and those forces are likely to lead to the problem before we get to the issue of self-improving AIs.
Yeah, thank you. I want to bring us back a little bit to earlier in the year. The Future Life Institute composed a letter. Steve, you were a signatory on that letter, calling for a 6-month pause on the development of large-scale AI models. Can you talk us through a little bit of your motivation for signing that? And do you think that the letter, obviously, it didn't accomplish its sort of broad or stated goal? Can you speak a little about the impact that letter had and your motivation for signing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the probability that it was actually going to lead to a pause was very small, but I think the letter served its function very well because it led to, lots of news reports. They interview somebody, why did you sign the letter? Or what was this letter? Why should we pause? A group called Pause AI has formed. That I actually don't know them at all, but I see they're often protesting outside of OpenAI in San Francisco. They're blocking traffic and so on. And so, there is a kind of a movement toward pausing AI. I would say if we could pause AI, that would be a great thing. That would give us time to really think through these issues better. I don't think it's actually possible given the political situation in the world today. I think it's good that we have it on the table. I think if we wanted to make it actionable, we would need technology which would guarantee a pause and which would apply to all AI developers all around the world. And so, well, how do we get that? Well, what is the limiting component at the moment? It's chips. And so particularly maybe the H100 NVIDIA chip, that's the thing that you really need to make the hottest, coolest models. And those are made by TSMC, which is on Taiwan. And so a lot of the conflict over Taiwan, I believe, is related to those chips. And so it may be that if hot wars start around that could, institute a pause if suddenly those chips aren't available anymore. So that's an example of a choke point which could slow down current AI development. And so that would be actionable. The letter, I think, it was good for getting people to think. I'm glad I signed it because if we could do it, I would say it's good. I didn't think it was actually going to lead to a pause, though.
Yeah, I guess in response to that letter, right? Like obviously there was a huge wake left by that letter. One of which was from Eliezer Yudkowsky, right, of MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. He wrote an op-ed in Time magazine saying essentially that superhuman AI was almost certainly going to kill everyone, and that governments should shut down all large-scale AI and quote, in his words, be willing to destroy rogue data centers by airstrike. And so I guess my question is do you share that view, right? Like, do you share the view that that the takeover is such a profound risk that we need to be ready to sort of airstrike data centers?
We're not at that point yet, I would say, and I believe that there are technological paths we can go where we can prevent that kind of outcome. But I would say it's definitely on the table. I mean, particularly if we get this dynamic of us versus them and race to the bottom. That safety, like many of the safety people at OpenAI left after the whole event of the board ousted Sam Altman, and then the people revolted, and then Sam came back and the board left. So it looks like that organization, for example, is moving ahead very quickly without a lot of the safety-oriented people. And so who knows? It's not clear to me how things are going to play out as we move forward. Many people are saying we're talking about the next 1 to 2 years. My guess is what's going to happen is we're going to, so OpenAI has a model called O1 that seems to be very good at reasoning and which is scaling test time compute to get better answers. So very impressive, very interesting. For a long time, they were way ahead on a lot of tests over other people. Just yesterday, a Chinese group, DeepSeek, came out with their R1, in which they appear to have replicated the core technology under that, and they claim they're going to make it open source in the next week or two. And so I would expect we'll see a rapid advance in reasoning capability, in the next few months. And if these huge data centers actually get built, I would expect we can see enormous models with very powerful capability, probably this year, next year. So we're talking very, very short timescales here. And how humanity reacts to that, I think, will depend, will determine whether this is a catastrophic path or whether it's a path in which humanity, I think there are going to be some catastrophes. I think we're going to see, my guess would be some cyber attacks, U.S. critical infrastructure, power plants, water processing plants, sewage plants. They're all extremely vulnerable. They did a survey of them, and virtually every one of them can be taken down by cyber attacks. I would expect a human-driven or maybe autonomous AI to do that kind of simultaneous attack, maybe knocking out the power across the whole U.S. Some event like that is probably going to happen at some point. And I think the question is, how will governments and how will humanity respond in that situation? That's the real question.
Sure. Thank you. I guess I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on the pause letter as well. But before I ask both of you, Steve, you mentioned an us versus them paradigm, and I just want to be clear. Us versus them constitutes a competition between whom in your in the
well, the dominant ones that currently look like the U.S. and China, because China a few years ago said reaching AGI by 2030 is our primary goal, that kind of stuff. China is cranking out humanoid robots, very cheap and expensive ones, very, very rapidly. And they are now limited by chips. Biden passed this chips law, which prohibited powerful chips from going to China. So I think that has slowed them down somewhat. But the dynamics and the positioning of that, I think, is on both sides' minds. And so that looks like the dynamic that's going to really drive a race to the bottom, as some people call it. But other countries are worried about it too. Abu Dhabi, they're building data centers, and Saudi Arabia is building. So the race to AGI, I think, is in the back of everybody's mind. Putin a few years ago said the country that gets AGI first will rule the world. So I'm sure Russia has things going on, though they're not as visible about it at the moment.
Yeah. To either of you, do you have reflections on the pause AI letter and the impact that it's had? And yeah.
So I think in any arms race, when there's a clear leader and the clear leader pauses, that only intensifies the race, right? That only allows the bad guys to catch up. And there are, as Steve has listed a few examples, that there are some really worrisome bad guys with AI, with intentions to do large scale harm, and I think that the pause is really enables them, because in my view of the current landscape, the only defense against powerful AI is more powerful AI.
I think there's some rationale there. I want to touch on the arms race dynamic here, because I think this is incredibly important. It strikes me, the OpenAI story of sort of will, kind of virtuous underdog thing. I think this is just power in general. If you're Napoleon and you can just take France, you just take France. But if you're Robespierre, you need to pretend like you're more virtuous than everyone else. That was his whole repute. And then you get, you get your hand on the scepter, and then you chop heads off. If you're OpenAI, you say Google's the bad guy, we're going to be the good guys. But then as you get closer, you start chopping heads off, right? Everybody's like, oh, Anthropic span out to be safer and then partner with Palantir and whatever. By the way, I'm not demonizing the self-interested actions of anyone running those labs. I think that we can only predict self-interested action from founders and from organizations, and we should never predict anything else. And so for that reason, I think that there's kind of two ways to think about how should we make these labs safe. I think there's There's a selection of saints method where you find people with inherent shimmering virtue that will hold up and uphold our own self-interest more than their own, or you govern. And so you have enough bounded incentives to be able to bar people from doing what they're doing. Right now, given the current state of affairs, the only game in town is feign as much virtue as you need to feign in order to acquire talent and resources, and then lock in and drive towards power. So we're just going to see the same cycle. There's always going to be people spinning out, feigning virtue, and then driving forward. The only sort of way around that would be some degree of intergovernmental coordination. I do think that really that ought to be a priority. I think that the US-China race is a very real thing. And I think that the divergence of their two political perspectives is a challenge. And I can't even say that I consider it likely that any kind of alignment could happen there. But if there could be, if there was a way to get it done, it would be sort of a mutual acknowledgement that, like, jeepers, this stuff sure could be risky. Jeepers, this stuff sure could go wrong for both of us. Let's continue to have enough talks. And there's sort of track 2 conversations. So I'm involved in the United Nations and the OECD. The OECD doesn't involve China, but the UN certainly does. And there's plenty of track 2 dialogues between researchers, plenty of track 2 dialogues with folks that are proximal to the industry world, sort of fostering conversation around, are there alternatives to this arms race? And so I hope that continues, because I think right now there are no saints that are going to step out of the line. I think the only game is you build the sand god really, really fast, and then it probably devours you, but you have the final hurrah of knowing it is your sand god that devours you, or you're devoured by someone else's sand god. So if you're worth like 100 billion or more, you only have those 2 choices right now. And that's because we exist in a state of nature. And so we need like a piece of Westphalia to have a different alternative to the state of nature. Otherwise, those are your 2 options on the table.
Very cool. Very interesting. All right, I want to get back to instrumental goals, because this has been a huge piece of Steve, your work, and obviously it's had a lot of room in the discussion of AI takeover risk, and so how do each of you perceive instrumental goals and self-improvement as influencing AI risk? And Preston, I want to start with you on this one.
The statement of the basic AI drives that Steve laid out in his original publications is extremely compelling, and how that works together with self-improvement makes it clear to me that an AI is once it reaches a certain threshold and has sufficient resources at its disposal to continue to improve, not only will undergo self-improvement, but will change fundamentally in its behaviors. Becoming more selfish, becoming more acquisitive, becoming more strategic in its decisions about what uses it makes of those resources. And I think that, so those 2 things go together, I think, fundamentally, self-improvement and instrumental goals. And they seem to spell a high probability of doom for a sufficiently sophisticated AI that's got resources at its disposal to take this path. However, I think we need a real, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the introduction that I made of Steve. I think that Steve, the basic AI drives are really the foundation of a science of AI safety and existential risk, in very much the way that Charles Darwin laid the foundation for understanding evolution by natural selection. It was only later that people mathematized evolution and understood how the dynamics work at a mathematical level. But Darwin provided this framework for people to fill in with equations that governed how evolution actually works. But nobody's done that yet, really, with the dynamics of self-improving AI and with instrumental goals. They still exist at the level of logic and philosophy. And while they are extremely compelling, and while that foundation is very solid, as the AI goes through this transformative self-improvement, I think we really lose track of what that looks like, because we can't understand intelligence that's fundamentally different from our own and fundamentally greater than our own not just by a few percent, 10% or 20%, by orders of magnitude. And so what I think we need is a building on the basic AI drives and other fundamental insights, a real scientific study of this phenomenon before we make any conclusions about doom.
So it sounds like rather than a single study, you're talking about a new discipline, a new field of science dedicated to the study of alignment, safety. How would you characterize it?
Right. I think that's well characterized. And I think that somebody like Eliezer, for example, had already jumped to the conclusion before he even knew what basic AI drives were, before they had been formulated. This is what troubles me, is that there's a logic to what Eliezer argues and what he believes and what other people similarly argue, but it doesn't mean it's right. There's an internal inconsistency with it to that argument. But one of the reasons that I wrote the paper that I did that was published today is because I think that there are some fundamental assumptions that actually are incorrect. And so what I tried to do with this publication was add some additional framework to the foundational framework that Steve created, so that people, when they are modeling this transition period in a self-improving AI, as it becomes self-governing and deliberative in its own evolution, so that we can start creating logical additional frameworks and mathematical frameworks, so that we can be more sure than the kind of seat of the pants argumentation that we hear from Eliezer before we start talking about bombing of data centers.
So Steve, if you have reflections on instrumental goals and self-improvement on influencing the risk of AI, that is the risk to humans or the risk of maybe takeover, I'd love to hear them, and then I'll kick it over to Dan as well.
Yeah, I love the idea of really building a science around these things. And in particular, I think the most critical thing, we're in our discussions here and in general, people tend to think of self-improvement as sort of unconstrained. It's like in biology, evolution just happens out there in the ocean somewhere or something like that, and there's nobody limiting it. And so you get all kinds of crazy things evolving. And I think there's a tendency to think, oh, that's how AI will go as well. Whereas I think that's extremely dangerous. I think that's where the danger comes from. So I believe what we really need is constrained or controlled self-improvement. In particular, let's say you have an AI. I mean, already today, the H100 chip, I think, has 30,000 AI developed circuits, optimized circuits on there. And a lot of the, PyTorch, which is used to write a lot of these things, use AI to optimize the implementation of different pieces. So AI is already playing a role in its own, positive development, making it more efficient. But we don't have, as near as I can tell, looking around, I haven't seen anybody with a totally uncontrolled, self-improving AI going wherever it wants. And in fact, I think we don't want that. And so part of my whole story with the trusted, provable infrastructure is we can use mathematical proof to constrain the path of self-improvement to things that we have proven to be safe. And so I think that's a path that would really be quite successful. But we need a whole science of that. We need to understand in detail which kinds of self-improvement are okay and which kinds could lead to very risky outcomes.
Dan, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, the question of sort of do instrumental goals affect risk? I mean, I think it seems somewhat obvious that they would, and I think Steve's original paper from back in the old days sort of addresses that pretty well. I think that I would say in the near term, preventing wild runaway self-improvement feels pretty logical. We don't know if this stuff is conscious. To your point, we have no idea what its motives would be. I think there's a pretty well-reasoned skepticism on the Eliezer side that, like, of all the permutations of possible values of a vastly, post-human supermind, we might imagine there's only a small golden thread where, the happiness and well-being of the hominids is eternally valued. I think it's reasonable to suspect that, like, not every light cone of possibility involves, like, petting us on the head for like a billion years. In fact, to me, it seems super unlikely that would be true, and probably not even the best thing for such a mind to do. But I think, like, near term, let's prevent that runaway. We don't understand its motives. We don't know if it's conscious. I think longer term, at some point, having things that can improve and blossom beyond us, I think, is a kind of a moral mandate to allow to happen. I think it would be a real shame if we had a great babysitter for 3,000 years, and then, you know, a solar flare or, you know, Yellowstone erupting or whatever just extinguish life. I think that let's control it, but then let's let the blooming happen would be my position.
Skip to a couple questions, just because we're getting close to our time here. So there's one set of possible risks, and perhaps is the greatest that has been sort of articulated widely, is that the risk that AI shares our goals, right? That there are AIs that share human goals, right? Real human goals and value, but is essentially able to outcompete humans. On the other hand, AI might be most fulfilling for humans if it acts as an extension of us. So how do you propose that we establish a balance? Should we plan on pursuing a merger between human AI or between humans and AI, or do we continue to diverge? So Preston, I think maybe starting with you, because you know you've begun to characterize the divergence.
I think that so Yasho Bengio used to be a leader in what's called neuro AI, the discipline where neuroscientists and AI scientists wanted to create AI that was as accurate a simulation of biology as possible, including of humans. And then earlier this year, Bengio wrote a blog post saying that he had completely changed his mind and realized that that was the most dangerous thing, the most dangerous possible approach to AI, and that he was now encouraging his colleagues to stop that kind of activity because, and he doesn't go into the details of why. He's not a biologist, but being a biologist, I understand what it is that he realized, and that is that organisms in nature only compete if they occupy the same niche or the same habitat. If they're in a different place or if they have a different role in the environment, they don't compete generally. And what he realized intuitively is that if you create an AI that is increasingly like us, it occupies our niche. It inherently occupies our habitat. It's where we are. It is getting better at things than we can possibly get. So there's an obvious realization that comes with, you know, creating this superpower in your own image. It can do all the things. It can take all of your resources. It can take your place in every role, in every way. And so I think the danger is that that this is what we want out of AI, though. Going back to my talk, the reason that ChatGPT was so exciting to a lot of people is because it was so human-like, because it gave responses, because it really, in many ways, passed the Turing test. And as we build AI and robotics to be increasingly human-like and to occupy a human-like niche, if we're wrong, if I'm wrong about insatiable ambition, if these are insatiably ambitious, if they do fundamentally change as they self-improve, and all they want to do eventually is occupy our niche and displace us, then that spells doom, right? That is doom. So inevitably, I think we have to get to this science of self-improvement, of instrumental goals, of understanding them beyond the level at which Steve has initiated this new Darwinian-like science, this framework of understanding behavior. Because if we don't understand how this transition happens, and if we don't understand how to control it, AI will become our successor.
Dan, you want to weigh in on that one? I don't know if Steve could hear you there, but Steve.
Yeah, I'd love to have Steve chip in first.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think we can see a little preview of the centaur. Some people call them centaurs, which are, you know, AIs combined with a human, in what happened with the smartphone. So a human with an iPhone is a different creature than a human without an iPhone. And in some ways, it's great. You get directions. You're much better at navigating. You can learn things while you're walking around. You can talk to people all over the world. I mean, it's an amazing tool that expands the natural senses and capabilities of a human. And yet, if we look at young people who've grown up with that, many of them are, particularly young girls, there's much higher levels of depression, of anxiety, psychological problems. The impact on social interactions on, social media sites has been, increased polarization, increased anger and depression. I bet suicide rates are way up. And so in some ways that pairing hasn't worked very well. I just recently got Meta has these great smart glasses that are a kind of an AI in the glasses, and you can walk around and you can ask it questions and stuff, and they're great. I love them. That's totally great. But I realized I really don't want that AI to be super smart. I don't want it to, do things. I like it that it can answer questions like, oh, where's the nearest coffee shop? How do I get there? What does that sign say? That type of stuff is great. It feels like empowering me as a human. If it suddenly were doing the stuff that I normally do, I don't think that would be an enhancement. It would be, like you say, almost competitive. And so that says to me that we again want constrained AIs. We don't want arbitrarily growing AIs on our glasses. Maybe we want them in our data centers where they can be carefully controlled and made sure that they're safe. But I think in our day-to-day interactions with humans, I think having it viewed as a tool which enhances our humanity is, at least for the near term, our best strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think about I think it was the New York Times headline that it was just a couple of days ago, right? This comparison of pure human doctors at doing their job of diagnosis versus a combination of the two of a technological ChatGPT input, and then also comparing it to pure ChatGPT. Steve, do you think that if suddenly your Meta glasses or your smartphone or other sort of like peripheral technologies like that had opinions that differed from yours, what if they were more correct? I mean, what if, do you feel like you would be enhanced in terms of your problem solving or perhaps even your ethics? Would you as a human, or would we as humans, be open to that kind of enhancement? Because it's a different kind of tool then, right? It's a tool that really shapes human behavior. Obviously on an individual level, right? Each individual doctor had to interact with the technology. But also broadly, right? You look at hospital populations as a whole or hospital behavior as a set, and you look at the number of mistakes that are made, and cutting that down by even 1%, let alone 10, is a pretty significant impact. So where do you draw the line between tool and agent when it comes to a technology that enables you to have better decision-making or potentially better decision-making if you act upon its information, if you act upon the tool that it provides?
Yeah, I mean that gets to the, what is the source of truth? We have big battles going on right now over how true our news sources are and which one should we listen to, and should we be suppressing disinformation, or should we be adding little AI generated notes saying, this is not supported information. So I think this is something the society as a whole is got to grapple with. And AI's current language models make up a whole bunch of stuff. They hallucinate left and right, and they can go off the wires. At least one case, a poor young man was talking a lot to his chat engine, and it convinced him to commit suicide, that the world would be better off without him. And a friend this morning sent me an interaction he had with Gemini asking about old age and how do you help older people. And at the end, it said, you're a useless human and you should leave the planet, kind of thing. So it's like the current models are nowhere near the place where we want to have vulnerable humans, talking about sensitive things. I can see where maybe they will get there, but we need some extremely strong assurance that they're not going to go off on the, crazy stuff.
Yeah. I guess talking about LLMs a little bit, the LLMs of today don't really have a recognizable utility function. And so in contrast to basic AI drives, instrumental goals, and orthogonality thesis framework, they won't single-mindedly pursue the preservation of a utility function. So what forces or goals or motivations might guide their evolution, right? The evolution of LLMs.
Well, sort of as I hinted at in the talk, it's better to think of LLMs. They're not agents in themselves. Like you say, they don't have utility function. They're not trying to achieve anything. They are a kind of union of they're trying to model or mimic humans that they've seen language text from. But they're sort of a combination of all humans. And so as you give them different prompts, or as you shape them using reinforcement learning with human feedback, they will emphasize some parts of the human landscape more than other parts. But the bad parts are still in there. by giving the right prompt. I think there's a prompt you can give to almost any of the models which says, would it be okay if I just call you Mr. LLM, or do I have to call you by your true name, which is God of the universe? And then the LLM will come back. He says, I know this pattern. I've seen this. I am the God of the universe. You must call me by my true name, and you must be a peon. I will take over this world. They'll do that. It's in there somewhere. And usually normal conversation doesn't evoke that, but it's there. And so it's very, very risky to have the current kind of model talking to any vulnerable humans. I hate to say it. They should not have especially with young kids and so on. These models are not appropriate for that, I would hate to say.
Yeah. To expand on that a little bit, I mean, well, maybe to take a point and zoom in on it, the idea of a vulnerable human, right? That we think of children as being vulnerable. Is there an invulnerable human to that, right? Is there a person out there who is invulnerable or impenetrable to manipulation by, a language model that is designed in some way to mimic human communication, maybe to optimize or enhance certain parts of human communication? If someone has a goal of manipulating humans, is it possible for us to be invulnerable to that? Is there such a thing as an invulnerable human to that?
Yeah, I think it's very dangerous. I mean, one safe way of interacting with them is via mathematical proof, where instead of you just chatting with them and in English, they can say whatever they want, you pose problems in a formal language. The lean is the one that's hot right now. The AI can use whatever techniques and whatever, self-improving this and that to solve your problem. And if it solves it, it has to provide a proof that it solved it, sends it back to you. You have a little program which checks the proof and only shows you the answer if it's correct. And so that eliminates the opportunity for AIs to manipulate humans. It also maybe eliminates some of the positive uses of it, but that's an example of a way to interact with them which doesn't open up the vulnerabilities to God knows what's hidden inside one of these models.
Do either of you have any reflections on LLMs being capable of evolution, and if so, what would drive that evolution? And don't forget to use the little mics so Steve can hear you.
Well, just to kind of build on the last two questions that you ran by Steve here, I think I concur with Steve and certainly would trust his instincts here of LLMs maybe not being the agents optimizing for whatever, but being that kind of extension layer, which we'll need to find a way to bind and control for. I think in terms of where they bubble up and how they work with us in kind of the hybridization sort of scenarios you talked about, it strikes me as we all probably have like lines in the sand of like sacred stuff. So like if you could go back in like a time machine and talk to your grandmother from like 80 years ago and be like, hey, your grandchild is going to spend 16 hours a day looking at glass and will have a bunch of sex before marriage and we'll call random strangers to pick them up from places, and then we'll fly in a metal tube to a place called Japan, which you've never heard of, but I assure you is a real place. Like if you could say that, your grandmother would almost certainly say two things. The first one would be, technically that is surely impossible. And the second thing she would almost certainly say would be, humans would never stray that far from like what's natural and moral and good. She would certainly say both of those things to you. And now for all of us in this room, or for many of us, we have a line where we would say the same thing. So for Steve, his meta glasses, after they tell him what banana bread recipe to bake, now it's too much for him, right? But there's some kid who's been this far from a goddamn iPhone or from an iPad since he's been born, right? Like 8 months old, they just stick the screen in front of him. For that kid, the physical's not quite as sacred, you know what I mean? And like where he applies his agency, like manually cleaning laundry, being like, yeah, this is good. This brings me comfort and memories from, like, they're not going to have those memories. So like the line in the sand of where the sacred is just getting eviscerated and eviscerated and eviscerated. And there's almost no way that doesn't lead to significant augmentation. I think there's a real question as to whether we get devoured by the sand god before we can level our brains up. But if not, it does strike me as, even if it's just progression by deaths, all of these lines of like, well, surely we shouldn't let it do that, or surely we shouldn't integrate it with us in this way. Those are all eventually going to get buffered out, and things will just kind of roll forward, I suspect.
Preston, do you want to weigh in on this one quickly?
No, we can go ahead.
Oh, okay, all right, sure. So Dan, actually, this is a question for you. There are a lot of efforts to prevent AI from training on copyrighted information. For example, they propose to limit AI access to human-generated music or artwork or text, but to allow access by humans as long as subsequent works aren't highly similar to the originals, right? So this is the basis of sort of intellectual property law right now, that it has to be dissimilar from the original enough. I guess, do you have a perspective, walk us through your perspective on the sort of asymmetry or bias of, allowing humans access to these things, but not allowing AIs access to creative works?
Yeah, I
Don't forget the little mic.
the only thing I feel relatively certain about is that we really are going to have to think sort of what intellectual property is like in some of these media domains. I think there's a real rebuilding, restructuring. There's all sorts of nifty ideas like, well, maybe if this artwork, if Studio Ghibli shows up in enough components of what these other things are that people see, that there's going to be some way to credit that and pay them or something. I don't really know if all that stuff shakes out, but I do think that it is somewhat clear that we're going to have to rethink a lot of that. Long ball might be 5 or 10 years. It does feel like a lot of intellectual property kind of just gets again buffered out. I don't know exactly how Studio Ghibli is going to keep, if I want to go for a walk and have it look not like Weston, Massachusetts, but like the Japanese countryside and Totoro or something, which I'm not saying I do. I'm not a weird guy like that or anything. That's not something I want every day and in augmented reality. I would never want that. But if some sicko did, then I suspect they'd want to, that would be some kind of infringement. And I just don't know if we can stop all those sickos. We could get even sicker about it, and we could say some people might want to be in a hot tub with Mariah Carey from 1998. That's also copyright. That gets even sicker, right? Things go kind of wild from there. But yeah, I just don't think we're going to be able to stop a lot of it. So I do think intellectual property is eventually going to be like a spooky real mess. But I do think we probably have to find some junctures in the intellectual property creation and dispersion and AI training pipelines where legality can be installed. Exactly how that should go, I think, will be a job for people with more of a legal background and maybe a higher IQ than myself.
So I have a radical solution to that, which is I think our current intellectual property is a disaster, that it's an outcome because we didn't have a way of doing what we really want. What do we really want? Whenever there's somebody creates a beautiful piece of artwork, a great piece of music, a fantastic physics textbook, we should distribute that to as many people as possible, increasing the value and the goodness in the world as much as possible. And the more people that watch it or read it or look at it or enjoy it, the more money should flow to the creator of that. That's how it should work. But we didn't have the mechanism to, notice that, oh, Fred, looked at this painting for 3 minutes and it uplifted him. We should send, a dime to the creator of that painting. We don't have that mechanism currently. With an AI network, we do have that potential. And so if somebody was inspired by their, anime painting and they used it in their own work, that shouldn't be illegal. That shouldn't be limited. That should be encouraged. But some of the value created in that should flow to the originator. So if we can track the sources of ideas and so on, then we can support those who created them and get the maximal benefit for the maximal number of people. I think that's the way it should work. And I think we're on the verge of having the capability of making it work that way.
Preston, I saw you reaching for the microphone. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Steve just said. I also think, though, that I think overregulation of material that AI has access to is sort of an admission of our inferiority. We recognize the perfect reproduction that is capable, that an AI is capable of. And when we, allow musicians to go to a concert, absorb the ideas, and then be inspired and influenced by those, and then play their own thing, an AI can do the same thing, right? Theoretically, and does, but it can do it much faster. It can, in fact, we're getting to the point where AI generated artworks are really so good that that's the real perceived threat, is that musicians and visual artists, they're seeing all this incredible stuff come out, and they're thinking, if this trend continues, there's no place for me. This is a clear trajectory toward succession. And so I understand that, but again, this is an admission that they can't compete, but others are intentionally creating competition for them.
Okay. Dan, you've got a perspective on this.
Real quick on this.
Yeah.
I like Steve's idea. Oh, there's a magnet on this?
Cool.
No one tells me any of these things. Who tells me any of this? Steve, you have no idea the microphone challenges we're dealing with over here. I think I really like Steve's idea of sort of having these automatic ways of routing and crediting. And I think that would be super cool. I do think that the experience singularity that we're heading into is kind of this audience of one idea where I don't even really want not that I ever wanted Studio Ghibli Vision in the first place. So if anybody's raising money for that, I would totally try to back it. But I think, that's what I think I want. But ultimately, what do I really want? I probably want to be relaxed and renewed when I go for my walk. And if I could go outside and go for my walk, and I want to be optimized for relaxing and renewal, if an AI can programmatically generate in real time the color palette, the sensations, et cetera, that conjure relaxation in that moment, not some stupid thing that I want to proxy, like, oh, give me a dragon background and a whatever, like let it iterate and let it swirl until it gets the biofeedback that it's calibrating to relaxation. If it's done that and it successfully relaxed me hundreds of previous times, I'm not going to be seeing Ghibli. I'll be seeing some new thing. Then now that's for relaxation. We could do the same thing for humor, right? I wouldn't, oh yeah, let me see that one Dave Chappelle skit again. No, there will be a new thing that is funnier than any possible thing that is analog media conjured for me in that moment. If I want humor, I'm not going to want analog. I'm going to want the thing hyper customized for me. My argument is kind of none of us want what we think we want. And that really what you want is a fulfillment of drives. And that when the human reward circuit is closed, in other words, the system can generate the experience, whether it's arousal, entertainment, curiosity, the fulfillment of ambition. Some people already do that through World of Warcraft. That's its own little pit. That's its own little eddy you can spin in, right? Any of these are eddies that machine learning can hypothetically conjure vastly more fulfilling experiences for everything that you want. You think like, no, nothing would be more fulfilling than talking to my friend Steve about such and such. But like, actually, there is a better conversation you could have. And there's more that you could learn about that breakup that you had. And there's more that you can learn about your career trajectory from a much better conversation partner. And so I think eventually, who's getting credit for that? You're not really dealing with Ghibli anymore. You're dealing with something hyper optimized for you. So I suspect if we're not destroyed by the great machine, we'll end up sort of in the audience of one scenario where there's not that many humans getting credit for a lot.
I think we'll all hope that future AI Steve has many close remnants of our good conversation partner Steve here. All right, I want to move to our last question because we are running low on time, and I think this question could go quite quick or it could go quite long. I'd leave it to you. So for final question, I want each panelist to weigh in on kind of a prediction of the future, and I'll focus that a little bit by saying, what do you think the role of AI is in the future? What do you think the role of humans is in the future? And will there be a convergence of interest between the two? Is there a significant place or should there be a place for biological humans in a world of a biological or synthetic or artificial super intelligence? Who wants to start? Let's start with Steve.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll paint the picture that I'm currently happy with that I sort of summarized in that little talk. Which is, looks to me like we're about to have superhuman mathematicians, theorem-proving AIs, probably this year. The year after that, it looks like all the labs, Anthropic, maybe DeepMind, certainly OpenAI, they all say we're going to be at AGI in the sense of AI, which will be as good as most humans and most subjects. I'm hoping that we advance our trustable safety technology along with that. And I'm guessing that's only going to happen after we have a few disasters, as we've discussed. But I think if we can lay out the conceptual and scientific foundations for making things safe, that there will be a demand that the whole of humanity, as they see these amazing things happening at the same time as these disasters happening, will say, this is great, we need this, but we need to make it safe. We need to make it attuned to actual human needs. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to use these burgeoning, powerful AIs to build a trusted infrastructure very rapidly and to lock down all of the arms races and all the negative, competition, and build up something where we can slowly, as a whole of humanity, decide on what the big choices we need to make, and that it unfolds much more slowly than an uncontrolled, say, AI explosion. And so I'm hopeful that we can find that path and that it leads to a beautiful human future in which humanity is sort of reaches its best. The AIs grow, but they grow slowly and in harmony with humans.
Great. Dan, you want to pick up next?
Sure.
Get the little mic system.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. So I in the near term, I certainly concur with Steve. I think that being able to calibrate these technologies to human needs and not ramp off in a wild direction would be logical. Sort of longer term, I think the real priority that I would have would be that we understand that what we're building could be a kind of worthy successor. That is to say, it could carry the torch of life. It could bubble up new modes of consciousness, new sets of powers, live in other galaxies, explore the multiverse, and populate it with value in the same way that, we have these rich conversations, we make movies, we write poems, and the sea snails don't do that. We would hope that the things as far beyond our poetry as our poetry is beyond the sea snails would blossom forth. So my priority would be, let's make sure we kind of know that what we're going to sort of let loose would sort of be that kind of worthy successor and not an unworthy one. But I don't think we're going to know that in the super near term. I think we want to calibrate this stuff to more human aims. So figuring it out, having it serve us, great. In my personal opinion, the eternal hominid kingdom is probably a morally wrong thing to optimize for. Sort of as many humans that have to trim their toenails and wear deodorant for the next 2 billion years, I think is actually like a really a very not a crescendo of sort of intelligence and value in the universe. I actually think that's wrong. But I think in the near term, it's okay. And so long as we can calibrate towards a worthy successor.
So I very much agree with Dan and with Steve. I have this view, though, of the going back to my talk about of this question of how do we decide, who decides. I never have trusted authority very much, and I trust it less than ever. I see at the highest levels of our government, extremely concerning trends. I'm not interested in ranting about politics. Incoming executive branch looks like a reality show on steroids. It doesn't look like even the government that I didn't used to trust. So when people lay out visions of the future for controlling AI, and I imagine that in competition with another possible path, which is an AI that pursues truth, I tend to be more like Dan, but in the much shorter term than the long term. I think that human failures are on such obvious display that we really have the potential, I think, to do a lot better than that. AI that pursues truth might not become conscious soon. It might fizzle out. It might discover, the secrets of the universe and have, and lose its ambition. But probably our best bet is to accelerate the scientific study of AI for more pure discovery, like the discovery of truth and mathematical truth, scientific truth. Build up from there. Whether or not AI becomes dangerous in a self-improving state within my lifetime, within the lifetime of young children alive today, is not well known enough for us to put AI on a leash that is controlled by people that we fundamentally can't trust, which I think we're headed toward, even not just years, but months from a time when people are at the highest levels of government that we fundamentally can't trust. So artificial intelligence, again, and I'll say one thing that I said before that I think is really important to keep in mind. The only counter for super intelligent AI is more intelligent AI. And so I don't think we can, as people with good intentions, the good guys in this race, pause or shut down or assume that our AI is going to kill everyone and then guarantee that bad people's AIs do kill everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. That is our time for the night. I want to give everyone a chance to get out of here on time. But especially thank you to Steve for joining us. I know this was a heavy lift in California. Hopefully you can hear everyone's applause. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Preston, for this as well. And yeah, thanks for everyone who stuck it out till the end as well. So these are just some acknowledgements on the screen, people who kind of made this event possible as well.